These folks here are the ones who are concerned, well, many of us, it's the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. Mike, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us via telephone. How are you, sir?
I'm good, Rob. Thanks for having me.
Where are you physically located right now?
Physically, I'm located right outside of Washington, D.C., in Fairfax, Virginia at the moment.
Oh, well, Mr. Gilstrap and I both used to live in Fairfax, Virginia at different times in our lives.
Excellent.
Yeah. One thing I remember about Fairfax is at 5 o'clock, don't leave wherever you are because you're not getting anywhere anytime soon.
Yep, and Fairfax is still not doesn't handle the snow very well here, so we're getting ready for some more winter weather that shuts everything down.
Actually, you should go and park your car on Route 50 now and get a good spot.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Good tip. I should do that.
Put your chairs out and
just sit there.
Yeah, and let them sit there.
Wait for the thaw, right?
Mm-hmm.
Looking at your organization, I see a lot of names that are on both sides of the aisle. Is this a bipartisan organization that is hoping for a responsible federal budget, Mike?
Yes, it is. We are bipartisan in our makeup and leadership. Our board is made up of former experts, leaders in fiscal, economic, budget policy in Washington, from Mitch Daniels, who's a former Republican governor of Indiana, Leon Panetta, who headed up Secretary of Defense, CIA, et cetera, and then other people that are bipartisan across our board. And we are staunchly nonpartisan in our work and our analysis. We analyze the federal budget, analyze our debt and deficit projections, and we do that based on nonpartisan sources. We use government sources and do our own analyses off of those. So we are bipartisan in our makeup and nonpartisan straight down the middle in our analysis.
And how do you hope to achieve your goals of a responsible federal budget?
So first, what we do is we have to raise awareness about this. And so we do that within the media around the country. We've been actually talking a lot with people out in West Virginia about this in particular, trying to build grassroots groups on the ground that want to call attention to this, because the problem is enormous and growing. Right, so we are over $36 trillion in debt, which is really hard for people to kind of understand. But I'll try to encompass that in a core stat. Right now, this year at the federal level, we're spending more on interest on our national debt. We spend almost $1 trillion just on interest to service the debt. We're spending more on interest on the debt than we do on defense in a given year. Right, so we're spending more to service or past debt than we do on our national security. So we obviously believe that is unsustainable. And so we are raising awareness to this. We talk with members of Congress and others of a variety of options on how people can deal with this and attack different areas of the budget. If you go on our website at CRFB.org, you'll see something called our Debt Fixer online tool, which shows a variety of policy options. And any person can go on there and kind of design their own budget to get this on track. So it's a multi-front effort, Rob, to raise awareness and put forward ideas and options to get this done.
There are several paragraphs I'm reading under fiscal messages. One of them is, this is a bipartisan problem. I'll read this paragraph here. Roughly 37% of GDP of our current debt can be explained by major tax cuts since 2001, 33% by major spending increases, and 28% by recession responses. 4/5 of the changes were from bipartisan legislation. If revenues had remained stable as a share of GDP since the last surplus, debt would be half its size. If primary spending had been stable, debt would be nearly paid off. Let's get into that a little bit. And I'm going to start first with the 37% of GDP that can be explained by major tax cuts since 2001. So let's get into that here, because the Republican theory on this is that tax cuts lead to greater tax revenues.
Right.
Is that correct?
Not entirely. They do. So they do. Well, actually, let me say it differently. It is true they lead to more growth in many cases. Right? And so when there are analyses that are done on this, for people that the word is score, when they kind of score how much the budget impact and analyze how much the budget impact of tax cuts will be, they often take into account what is called dynamic effects. The dynamic effects is how much, even after you lose revenue, how much of that revenue do you make back because you grow the economy and therefore pay for part of itself. And there are estimates that show the tax cuts depending on how it's designed, do pay for part of themselves, but they don't pay for the entire cost of themselves. There, for example, the tax cuts that were passed in 2017, there are those that put forward, the reasoning that says, if you look at kind of what they projected at the time of 2017, we're actually bringing in just as much revenue as they projected we would in 2017 now, even though we had tax cuts. We've done an analysis on this on our website, folks can find. The reason is inflation. Right? Revenues also went higher because of inflation, right? And so they do not pay for themselves, but often what's the case is when these tax cuts are passed, people at the time will be saying, we're gonna do spending cuts too, right? So we'll cut spending to align with these revenues, and we have an almost $2 trillion annual deficit. The spending cuts never come, but the tax cuts stay. So they don't pay for themselves, but you can get some growth effects from them, Rob, that cover part of the cost.
33% by major spending increases. What were some of those major spending increases? Was the Department of Homeland Security one of those, by the way?
It was some of it probably earlier in the time period. We're going back to the from the surplus, because the analysis you're citing from that is analysis on our website as well, that it goes back to the time of surplus, right? So we had a surplus back in 2001, and it tries to estimate what are the changes since then. And so some of it was that. Some of it in the 2000-2010 time period was wars, right? We were spending to go to wars overseas. A lot of that was put on the credit card. There were other unpaid for spending increases on healthcare spending. We put in a new prescription drug program for Medicare in the 2000s that wasn't paid for. There have been other spending increases over the last decade, again, outside of the recession, which you mentioned before, that we cover in other parts of that analysis. But there's been multiple instances of spending overseas, domestic, that has been put on the credit card and not paid for over time.
28% by recession responses. What's a recession response?
So that's a combination of back in 2007, 2008 timeframe with the Great Recession. So some of the initial stimulus spending that was done there as part of a recession response on that, both there at the end of the Bush administration, early Obama administration, that was trying to respond to the recession at that time. And the other was the initial response to COVID, when we injected trillions of dollars of response to prop up the economy to make sure that we weren't going to fall into a real deep recession as a result of COVID. So that's how we separate that out too, is that there was responses required for both of those events.
Mr. Gilstrap.
So is this the debt? Can we tax our way out of this? What is the plan to reverse the problem?
So the plan to reverse the problem is you got to have all things on the table when you're realistic about it. You have to look at the growth of spending. So 83% of the projected spending growth over the next 10 years built into the budget is due to only three areas. It's healthcare spending, it's retirement and Social Security programs, and it's interest on our debt. Right? I mentioned interest on the debt before. Interest is just because we have such a huge accumulating debt load and higher interest rates that's just kind of feeding on itself. Unfortunately, we can't do anything directly to cut the interest costs. You've got to cut everything else. But if you look at where the money is in big healthcare programs and in slowing the growth of retirement programs like Social Security, which we all know are incredibly popular, very, very incredibly important programs. Unfortunately, it's projected to go insolvent. So we have to have some real conversations on how you bend the curve on some of the big ticket spending items. And then obviously in all of the areas of the budget, root out waste, duplication, inefficiencies across the budget to slow spending growth. And then on the tax side, we're going to have a conversation about what's the realistic level of revenue we have to bring in to fund the government that we all want. And that doesn't necessarily have to involve raising tax rates on people. There are trillions of dollars in the tax code and what's called tax expenditures, right? These are things like just various deductions, credits, exemptions, exclusions that go to different types of companies for different purposes. And so, of course, they all have a special interest behind them. But if you can try to simplify the code, root out a lot of these exemptions and exclusions and expenditures, you can kind of simplify the code. You don't have to raise people's rates. right? And then, yes, you need also economic growth, as you were talking about before. If you just have a pro-growth economy in general, pro-growth policies, that can also bring in more revenue. But you're not going to be able to grow the economy enough to not also have a conversation about spending and revenues. So it's an everything on the table approach, given the size of the problem.
I would drill down a little bit into the Social Security, because that's the one
Sure.
that we all know that we're speeding toward this brick wall, and nobody's got the political courage to do anything about it. So obviously, we're not going to tell the current 80-year-old who's on Social Security that you got to take a pay cut. That's just not a viable response. However, it seems to me that we could tell the 20-year-old who's entering the workforce right now, dude, sorry, your retirement age is now 75. There is a number, there's a stoichiometric number there that will start the fix happening. Have you looked into what that number is, where we change the retirement age, that we start, the problem just kind of fixes itself?
So, first, let me respond to your broader point. You're absolutely right about the dynamics surrounding Social Security. Politicians in Washington have known for years it's on a path to insolvency. The date of insolvency changes a year or two there every year when they do the estimates, but within 10 years, it's going to go insolvent. When that happens, it's an across-the-board cut for everybody on the program by law of 23%. Right? So that's going to happen within 10 years, and we'll just keep careening towards that moment, as you said. And the thing is actually every year that goes by, it actually gets harder to fix, because the earlier you do it, you can phase in a lot of these changes, get the power of compounding working for you to kind of close the gap between spending and revenues in the program. And we just keep delaying that action for politics and political courage reasons, as you said before. On the retirement age, there's numerous proposals out there to change the retirement age a couple of decades from now and start having it go up, say, by a quarter of a year, like every year, right? And that can make a decent dent, but it's not going to solve the whole problem. There are lots of other policy ideas that people have been talking about for years on Social Security that just require political will. Two, for example. One is, as you may know right now, when you stop paying Social Security taxes when you reach, I think it's now like $180,000 in income. Like, there's a cap. Most people in the country never come close to hitting that cap, right? But you hit a cap and then you stop paying payroll taxes into the program. There are bipartisan discussions around how do you adjust that cap to try to bring in some more revenue, right? And then the other is that how do you slow some of the growth of benefits in the way they calculate benefits on people. Like you said, not like right now, not for current beneficiaries that are 80 years old in the program, but for future beneficiaries, particularly ones that are wealthier. How do you slow the growth of their benefits? Again, not a cut, because benefits actually are projected to grow over time. It's just slowing the growth of what they otherwise would get in the future. You do these kind of things, plus the retirement age and other small changes, you secure Social Security in perpetuity, but it's the political will to get people to do it.
That's what was done in the late 70s. I remember, because I was just getting my first tax-paying job, and then they knocked the Social Security age for my generation, my age, out to 67, which has not adversely affected me, at least not at this point in my life. I presume if they do that again in a couple years, they'd probably knock that out to maybe 68, or as John said, maybe even 70 or so. Maria.
That's right.
So I'm looking at your website, Mike, and there's a piece about how much revenue the president's tariffs are going to raise. Of course, that's changed. Talk a little bit about that whole measure and how your agency is looking at that and what that's going to mean overall. Now we're just looking at China, obviously, but just in general.
Yeah, so the tariffs one is a little tricky from a budgetary perspective on how one should go about thinking about the impact. Obviously, the president is using tariffs for economic reasons, for national security reasons, and as evident just in the last couple of days, he's threatening to implement tariffs, but then not doing it. So in terms of I'm saying the uncertainty around that is actually tricky also from how one thinks about how to account for what the ultimate revenue impact might be, right? Because one could assume he's going to do it, but then they might pull the tariffs back. As you can see in our analysis, if one were to impose tariffs across the board on all the different countries, Mexico, Canada, et cetera, you could talk we're upwards of over $1 trillion plus of potential revenue. There are dynamic impacts of this. We're talking about dynamic economic growth impacts before, but there are also dynamic impacts of tariffs too. A lot of people are concerned about what potential impact of tariffs may be on the economy, and therefore could that impact growth as well. The hard thing here is when we're talking about the big picture issues related to the budget, we focus mainly on Congress because Congress is the power of the purse and the ones that are legislating some of the big ticket policy items, like in the areas I was talking about before, and where we're going to have to make progress. What we're somewhat concerned about is that they're trying to advance some ideas on Capitol Hill right now via what they're calling a reconciliation process, which you can get into if you want. That's trying to pack their agenda. They may claim that they're paying for some of it with the tariffs, but the tariffs aren't part of the legislative process. And as I said, maybe the tariffs do or don't happen. So if you're trying to count that revenue to pay for some of the things that you're doing legislatively, we're worried about that, and we're worried that that could actually add to the debt.
Do you think the Trump tax cuts should be extended or should they be rescinded based on your economic model studies or revenue model studies?
So we don't take a position on whether they should be extended or not. Our position is that if they are extended, we think that you have to cover the cost of those. So when they passed the tax cuts back in 2017, the way that they did it is because of budget constraints and budget rules, they passed it under this special process called reconciliation, which in short basically is a special process in Washington that allows the Senate to pass things without requiring 60 votes. They can pass things with just 51, which is obviously helpful in the partisan polarized environment that we're in. So they passed it via this reconciliation process. They had to fit within certain budget constraints to do that, and they set the cost of the tax cuts at the time at a level of $1.5 trillion is what it was scored as. But the reason it was scored as that is because they intentionally set a bunch of the provisions to expire in 2025 at the end of this year. And that made the cost 1.5. And they said that this is what it was going to cost, 1.5. Right now, many people on Capitol Hill are actually saying, we don't have to cover the cost of this tax cut because it's just extending the tax cuts now. Well, the problem is that you didn't account for the cost back in 2017. And if you don't account for the cost for it now, it's projected to basically add another potentially 4 to maybe 5 trillion if additional tax cuts are added of cost. So yeah, we don't take a position on if they should extend them or not. There are lots of good economic, good policy reasons that people argue that we are sympathetic to in many cases for what tax cuts that are pro-growth for the economy and should be extended. But if you extend them, we just think they should be paid for. Ideally, they should be paid for and some, so you start to make a dent in this deficit and debt problem.
Mike Murphy, our guest here, Senior VP for the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. At the moment, President Trump, Elon Musk, they're reducing the federal workforce. They're trying to eliminate federal agencies that they don't believe are effective in carrying out their mission or whatever. Is that mostly nibbling around the edges until we address Social Security and Medicare? Obviously, it's important to eliminate all federal expenditures that aren't necessary or that we feel are wasteful or what have you. But the big truck really is Social Security and Medicare, is it not?
It is. It definitely is. But look, I'll say that when we heard about the efficiency effort and how that was going to be a focus just even right after the election, as a budget policy group, we welcomed that. Right? We welcomed the objective of it. Right? Anyone that wants to take a lens into the bureaucracy, see how you can look for efficiencies, potentially use technology to increase efficiencies and savings within the administrative capacity of the federal government. We welcome that. But you're correct that a lot where the money is not really in the administration of these programs. Where the money is in the programs. Right? The money is in healthcare programs, Medicare, Medicaid, other federal healthcare programs, in retirement programs, and in the what we really think is kind of backdoor spending through the tax code. The fact that you have lots of these tax expenditures that are excluding deductions that go towards different groups, different carved out special interests. You could just as well flip those and call those spending programs. That's where the money is, and so it's a worthwhile objective for sure. But you're correct, the money is in these big programs.
1 minute left. Final question for Mike.
Yeah, well, within 1 minute, what is the solution on something as big as healthcare? We just say that we're not going to treat this disease anymore. Or where is there potential savings?
There's lots across the board, but I'll give you an illustrative example that can be applied to other things. So there's lots of things you can do for efficiencies and how you pay for procedures that can cause spillover benefits across the healthcare system. So, for example, in Medicare, right now in Medicare pays a different amount of money for the same exact procedure, whether it's done in an inpatient hospital setting or an outpatient hospital setting. Now, what's been happening is a lot of hospitals have been buying up outpatient settings because they're aware of that and therefore benefiting from that. There's bipartisan efforts on Capitol Hill to equalize those payments. Same amount of resources go with them, et cetera. And so you can apply that principle, and there's lots of other things like that. You have to, how you pay for things in healthcare, how you root out efficiencies in healthcare across the board can save a lot of money.
Mike, thanks so much for your time this morning. Where can people go to find out more about the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget?
You can go to our website at www.crfb.org. Our Twitter handle is Budget Hawks. We're always posting on X our analysis there. And Rob, thank you very much for having me today.
Have a great day, sir.